Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. The blackened sky of the barren world crackled with the ominous hum of Zoroth warships as they descended onto the scarred surface of the planet. The alien ships cut through the air with precise grace, as if they were creatures born to fly. Inside the lead ship, Draxon, the most fearsome warrior in the Zoroth Empire, stood silently, his intense eyes reflecting the cold, red lights of the war room. He had never failed a mission, and today would be no different. His thoughts were laser-focused on the task at hand, the extermination of a human colony that had refused to bow to Zoroth rule. It was an anomaly in the Empire's unyielding conquest. Humans, so frail and seemingly insignificant, had managed to withstand the relentless onslaught of their technologically superior invaders. But not for long. As the ship touched down on the outskirts of the human settlement, Draxon could already sense the tension in the air. The atmosphere was thick with the lingering scent of fear, mixed with the unmistakable stench of defiance. It was strange. Zoroth warriors were trained to suppress all emotions, to see everything through the lens of pure logic. But there was something about this place, something that stirred a feeling deep within him, something unfamiliar. His boots made a hollow thud as he stepped onto the dusty soil, his sharp gaze scanning the horizon. The colony appeared desolate, as if its people had resigned themselves to defeat. But Draxon knew better. These humans were not like the others he had encountered, trembling in their cages. No, these humans fought with a desperate, unyielding tenacity that intrigued him. It was admirable. Without a word, he activated his communication device and gave the order, "Engage the perimeter." His soldiers, draped in black armor that blended into the night, moved swiftly, their movements synchronized. Draxon's presence was like a storm on the horizon, and the humans knew it. As he advanced, the ground trembled under the weight of his armor, each step a reminder of his unstoppable force. In the distance he spotted her, a human. Her figure stood tall and resolute against the backdrop of the ruined settlement. Captain Eleanor Hayes. He had heard of her, a leader among her people, a warrior in her own right. She was no ordinary human. Draxon could sense the strength in her stance even from this distance. Captain Hayes, Draxon's voice echoed through his helmet's comms system, his tone a low growl. "Your resistance ends here." The human woman did not flinch. She did not run. Instead, she met his gaze with a fire that seemed to burn hotter than any of the Zorotha's advanced weaponry. Her eyes were fierce, unwavering. "It ends when we say it does, alien," she replied, her voice steady. "We fought too long to let you take this world without a fight." A brief moment of silence hung between them, and for the first time in his life, Draxon felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest. It was not fear or respect. No, his species did not feel those things. But it was something. Something that made his mission feel different. He raised his weapon, a gleaming plasma cannon capable of obliterating an entire building with a single shot, and aimed it squarely at the heart of the human leader. "You will die today, Captain. Your people will be crushed beneath the heel of the Empire." Eleanor didn't flinch. Instead, she raised a hand, signaling her soldiers to prepare. "We'll see about that," she said, and in that moment, Draxon knew she wasn't bluffing. A brutal firefight erupted between the Zoroth and the human defenders, with plasma bursts lighting up the sky like shooting stars. Draxon, moving like a force of nature, cut through their lines with ease. His strength was unmatched and his movements were a deadly dance. But there was something different about the humans. They fought with an intensity he had never encountered. Each shot they fired was carefully aimed, and their tactics, while crude, were surprisingly effective. The humans were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for something greater. Amidst the chaos, Draxon found himself face to face with Captain Hayes. In an instant, she dodged his swing, a quick move that sent a sharp pain through his shoulder as her bullet struck its mark. It wasn't a fatal wound, but it was enough to jar him. He took a step back, his hand instinctively clutching the spot where blood began to seep through his armor. The pain was strange. It was a feeling he had not known before, sharp, fleeting, and almost human. He looked at her, then truly looked at her. Captain Hayes was breathing heavily, her eyes never leaving his. There was no fear in her gaze, only determination, defiance, and a fire that burned brighter than the plasma he wielded. "You're not like the others," Draxon murmured, his voice barely audible over the sound of battle. "I told you," she replied, her voice steady, "we fight for something worth dying for." Draxon paused, his mind racing. For the first time in his existence, he questioned the meaning of his conquest. The Zoroth had always taken worlds, crushed civilizations underfoot. But these humans, these fragile creatures, had something he could not comprehend, something he now wanted to understand. The battle raged around them, but for a moment, everything stood still. Draxen turned away, his mind whirling with new thoughts. This mission would not end the way he had planned. The sounds of battle raged in the background, but for Draxen they had become distant. His mind, usually as sharp and unyielding as his body, was caught in a whirlwind of confusion. The pain from the wound in his shoulder, though minimal, had triggered something deep inside him. It wasn't just the physical sensation. No, it was the realization that the human woman, Captain Eleanor Hayes, had wounded him. Not just in body but in something he had never known existed. He looked down at his shoulder where the blood oozed, soaking through his armor. His instincts told him to heal it, to disregard the injury and continue the mission, but the small, weak feeling in his chest was unshakable. This wasn't like any other mission he had ever undertaken. The humans, no she, had provoked something within him. He was no longer sure what to think. The battle continued to rage, but Draxen stood still amidst the chaos, his gaze locked on the horizon. His soldiers were methodical in their assault, cutting down any human who dared to oppose them. The sight of the human forces retreating into their fortified base did not faze him. It only gave him more reason to finish what he had started. Yet, a part of him, the part that he could not ignore, seethed with questions. What was it about her that had caused him to hesitate? Why had she, a simple human, wounded him with such ease? There were countless explanations, but none of them offered the clarity he sought. His eyes flicked back to the figure of Captain Hayes as she disappeared into the shadows of her base. Even though he could not see her face, he could sense her presence. Her determination was palpable, like an invisible force pulling him in. For the first time in his life, Draxen found himself uncertain of his next move. Eleanor had not expected to survive the encounter with Draxen. But somehow she had. Wounded, yes, but alive. She stumbled into the base's interior, her soldiers rushing to her side. The pain in her side was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her mission was still incomplete, and she would not let a wound stop her. "Captain," Lieutenant Gregor called, his voice filled with concern. "We need to get you to medical." "I'm fine," she snapped, cutting him off. She glanced at the digital readouts on the wall, which showed the enemy's position. "We have to hold our ground. Draxen will be back. And when he does, we'll need to be ready." The lieutenant hesitated, but he could see the steel in her eyes. Despite the bloodstains on her uniform, despite the fact that she had just been face to face with the most dangerous warrior in the galaxy, there was no sign of fear. Only determination. Draxen had wounded her. Yes. But it was nothing she couldn't recover from. What worried her was the fact that she had wounded him. That had not been part of the plan. The humans had expected to hold out for as long as they could, but Captain Hayes knew something deeper had shifted. She had seen the flicker in Draxen's eyes after she shot him. It wasn't just rage. It was hesitation. A weakness. And that weakness, she realized, could be her key to survival. As Draxen paced slowly through the abandoned village, his thoughts continued to race. The humans had been able to wound him, yes. But that was not the real problem. The problem was how they had done it. It was not a weapon that had caused the pain, but a human, a woman who had forced him to confront something deep within him. For the first time in his existence, Draxen felt something akin to doubt. It wasn't fear. No, he had no concept of fear. But the feeling was unmistakable. He, the perfect warrior, the most powerful being in the galaxy, had been made to feel vulnerable. He had never cared for vulnerability, but now it gnawed at him. He had studied humans, at least from what the Zoroth archives told him. They were weak, emotional creatures, prone to infighting and short-lived lives. But none of that had prepared him for the raw defiance he had seen in Captain Hayes. Her refusal to bow before him had left him shaken in a way he couldn't explain. The humans were, in many ways, inferior. But they fought with something the Zoroth could not comprehend, an unwavering will to survive. And it was in her eyes, that brief moment of defiance, that something inside him shifted. What was it about her? Why did he feel this strange desire to understand her, to see what lay beneath the surface of her fierce exterior? Draxen stopped in his tracks, his mind still trying to process the thoughts that now filled his every waking moment. He could not allow himself to be distracted by something as fleeting as curiosity. He had a mission. The Empire had entrusted him with this task and he would see it through. But as he looked toward the human base, something in him resisted. He wanted to see her again. Inside the human base, Eleanor had assembled a small team of her best soldiers. They were weary, their faces drawn with exhaustion, but their resolve was unbroken. "We know what he's capable of," Eleanor said, looking over the group. "And we know he's coming back. But we're not going to let him win. We've held out this long and we're not giving up now." One of her soldiers, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant O'Malley, looked up from his weapon and spoke. "But Captain, what if he's not coming back for us? What if he's come back to finish what he started?" Eleanor's gaze hardened. "He's coming back for me. And when he does, I'll be ready." She wasn't afraid of death. She had seen too much of it in her time. But what unnerved her now was the thought that Draxon might not be like the others she had fought. He had hesitated. He had paused. There was something else there. Something more than just the instinct to destroy. It was a vulnerability she hadn't expected, and it stirred something in her own heart. A hope that, somehow, the warrior who had hunted them for so long might not be the monster they had all assumed. The next day the humans' worst fears came to pass. Draxon returned to the base, his heavy steps making the ground tremble beneath him. But this time he did not come alone. His soldiers were with him, their black armor gleaming in the dim light. But there was something different in Draxon's eyes. The humans had no choice but to fight. Draxon's gaze locked with Captain Hayes as she stood at the base's entrance, ready to face him. He could see the wound she had inflicted on him, but he felt no anger. There was only a strange sense of anticipation. He was not here to destroy. Not yet. This time it was personal. The sun hung low over the alien landscape, casting long, twisted shadows across the battlefield. The Zoroth forces stood poised, their weapons ready, their movements precise. The human defenders, battered but unyielding, gathered at the base's entrance, preparing for the inevitable. The calm before the storm was thick with tension, each soldier acutely aware that the moment Draxon's forces arrived, there would be no turning back. In the heart of the base, Captain Eleanor Hayes stood with her team, her thoughts a blur. She had spent sleepless nights preparing for this final confrontation, but nothing could have prepared her for the strange turn of events that had unfolded in the past few days. Draxon had hesitated. That moment of weakness, that flicker of vulnerability, had changed everything. It was as if the very essence of the Zoroth warrior had cracked, if only for an instant. She could not explain it, but she knew one thing for certain. Draxon was different. There was something inside him that had been awakened. And that something was no longer the cold, merciless hunter she had expected. Now it was a force she could neither understand nor predict. "Captain," Lieutenant Gregor's voice broke through her thoughts. "We've got movement on the ridge." "It's them?" Eleanor snapped to attention. Her heart raced, but she refused to let her fears show. They were ready. They had to be. "Positions, everyone. Stay sharp." The moment she stepped outside the base, she saw him. Draxon stood at the head of his army, towering over his soldiers. His armor gleamed in the fading light, his helmet giving him an almost godlike appearance. But it wasn't just his physical presence that commanded attention. It was the way he stood, how his gaze seemed to seek her out amidst the chaos. She could feel it even from this distance, the pull. It was as if he was drawn to her, as if he wanted something more than just victory. The Zoroth warlord's gaze met hers, and in that moment, the world seemed to still. The air crackled with tension, both from the battle that was about to unfold and from something far more personal. "Captain Hayes," Draxon's voice boomed across the field, his deep, metallic tone carrying through the quiet air. "I've come to finish what I started." But there was something different in his tone. The command, the cold detachment was still there, but beneath it there was something else. Something almost uncertain. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what he wanted, but she wasn't about to back down. "You'll have to kill me first, Draxon," she called back, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Draxon paused, the faintest flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. It was a momentary hesitation, but it was enough. Enough to make Eleanor question everything she thought she knew about the Zoroth warrior standing before her. "Your death would mean nothing," Draxon replied, his voice cold but tinged with something deeper. "You are but a human, a fleeting existence in a vast universe. You and your people are doomed." Eleanor shook her head, her resolve hardening. "Maybe. But we'll make sure you remember us, Draxon. And that's something you can't take away." The words seemed to hit him harder than she expected. For a brief second, Draxon's hand twitched as if to raise his weapon, but instead, he let it fall to his side. His head tilted slightly, a faint gesture of curiosity. Before she could react, the Zoroth forces surged forward, and the battle erupted with ferocity. Blasts of plasma filled the air, tearing through the earth and sending shockwaves through the human defenders. Draxon's soldiers advanced with precision, their movements synchronized as they closed in on the base's defenses. But even as they advanced, Draxon remained rooted in place, his gaze still locked on Eleanor. She could feel the weight of his attention, the almost palpable pull between them. She had faced many battles, fought many enemies, but never had she felt so exposed. It was as if Draxon could see straight into her soul, as if he was waiting for something, some sign that she would break. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. "Hold the line," she shouted, her voice carrying over the noise of the battle. "For humanity. For freedom." Her soldiers rallied behind her, moving with determination as they fought back the Zoroth forces. Eleanor fought alongside them, each strike a desperate act of defiance. But even in the heat of battle, her mind kept returning to Draxon. What was it about him? Why did he hesitate? Draxon's focus never wavered. As his soldiers clashed with the human defenders, he could hear the sounds of war all around him. Plasma blasts, the roar of weapons, the screams of soldiers. It was the symphony of battle that he had come to know so well. But none of it mattered. Not now. All that mattered was the woman. Captain Hayes. He had expected to feel anger, to relish the final moments of her life as she begged for mercy at his feet. But instead, there was only an unsettling calm that wrapped itself around him. The humans fought fiercely, but they were outmatched. He had no doubt they would fall just as the others had. Yet, in the back of his mind, a question lingered. Why didn't she break? Why hadn't she run when she had the chance? Her words echoed in his mind, "You'll remember us, Draxon." He had dismissed them then. But now, standing in the midst of the battle, he could not rid himself of the thought. He had seen countless species fall to the might of the Zoroth Empire, and their names had been forgotten, erased from the universe. But these humans, this human, had given him a glimpse of something different. Something that neither his people nor his training had prepared him for. He could feel her gaze on him even as the battle raged around them. It was an unspoken challenge, one that burned brighter than any of the weapons being fired. She had made him question his mission, his purpose, and in doing so, she had shattered the cold indifference that had once ruled him. Eleanor fought with everything she had, but even she knew the odds were against them. Draxon was a force unlike anything they had faced before. His soldiers were relentless, their weapons overwhelming. She could see it in their eyes, their confidence, their cold certainty that victory was assured. But still she refused to back down. She refused to let the last remnants of humanity's fight end without a challenge. As she fired her plasma rifle at an advancing Zoroth soldier, her eyes flicked up to Draxon. He was standing apart from his forces, his expression unreadable beneath his helmet. And then for a moment their gazes locked. There was something there, something she couldn't name. It was almost as if, in that brief exchange, the entire universe fell away. It was just the two of them, standing on opposite sides of a war that had stretched far too long. Draxon raised his hand, and for a moment, Eleanor's heart skipped. Was this it? Would he give the order to end it all? But instead of giving the command to obliterate them, Draxon's hand dropped, his eyes never leaving hers. The hesitation was there again. It was subtle but unmistakable. And in that moment Eleanor knew. The battle had only just begun. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal and scorched earth. The battlefield had become a chaotic blur of flashes and explosions, the sounds of plasma fire and the cries of soldiers drowning in the cacophony of war. But for Captain Eleanor Hayes, the world had narrowed. She no longer saw the endless stretch of alien invaders or the destruction around her. All that remained was Draxon. His form loomed tall and imposing in the distance, his soldiers pushing forward relentlessly as they breached the outer defenses of the human base. The humans were fighting with everything they had left, but it was clear to Eleanor that they were outmatched. Draxon's warriors were far more organized, more efficient. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, there was something unsettlingly different in his movements, something that gnawed at her, something she couldn't ignore. She fired another shot at an advancing Zoroth soldier, her aim true, but her mind was still on him. Draxon. What? Why had he not struck the killing blow? Why had he paused during the initial clash? Why was he still standing there, not commanding the full force of his army, but instead watching her like a hawk? There was something in his gaze that went beyond the cold calculation of a conqueror. She had fought enough battles to recognize it. There was doubt in his eyes. But doubt about what? It made no sense. Captain? Gregor's voice brought her back to reality, snapping her out of her thoughts. We need to fall back to the secondary perimeter. We can't hold this position much longer. Eleanor looked around, assessing the situation. The Zoroth forces were closing in. The main barricades had fallen. There was no more time for hesitation. Pull back. All units fall back, she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "We'll make our stand at the secondary line." Her soldiers moved with swift precision, retreating to the secondary defenses as they continued to fire at the advancing invaders. But as they moved, Eleanor's eyes flicked back to Draxon. He hadn't moved. He was still standing there watching her. Her heart pounded in her chest, a strange mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't name. What was it that he wanted? Draxon's thoughts were equally as tumultuous as he stood amidst the destruction. His soldiers continued to press forward, cutting down the humans with brutal efficiency. Yet even as he gave the orders, his mind was elsewhere, focused solely on the human woman who had captured his attention. He could feel the pull between them, a force he could not explain, but one that seemed to grow stronger with every passing moment. It was more than just the physical pain she had caused him, more than just the fact that she had wounded him and made him bleed. There was something about her defiance, her refusal to bow to him, that had awakened something deep inside him. For the first time in his life, Draxon was unsure. He had fought countless battles, faced warriors from every corner of the galaxy, and never once had he felt this conflict. He was a Zoroth, a conqueror. He had been bred for war, for destruction, for domination. He had never known doubt, never questioned the orders given to him. Until now. The humans fought with an intensity that he had not expected. They were weak, yes, but they were resilient. And that resilience had forced him to pause. It was as if they weren't just fighting to survive. No, they were fighting for something else, for something greater. And somehow, in the midst of that, it was as if he could feel a flicker of that same fight within himself. Eleanor Hayes had wounded him, yes. But more than that, she had made him feel. And now, in the midst of this battle, he found himself questioning his very purpose. What was it all for? Victory? Conquest? Or something else? The secondary perimeter was already a battlefield when Eleanor and her team arrived. The barricades had been hastily set up, and the soldiers were doing their best to dig in, firing at the advancing Zoroth forces. But even here the humans were losing ground. The invaders were relentless, pressing forward with a single-minded fury. Eleanor's heart sank as she saw the numbers on her side dwindling. Their ammunition was running low. Their defenses were crumbling. And yet, as she surveyed the battlefield, her gaze once again found Draxon. He stood there, almost like a specter, unmoving amidst the chaos. He was no longer simply the leader of the Zoroth army. He had become something more, something impossible to define. She could feel his presence like a weight on her chest, suffocating and strange. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that he could end it all with a single order. But instead he remained still, watching her. "Why are you doing this?" she muttered to herself, the words barely audible over the sounds of battle. But she already knew the answer. He wasn't here for destruction. Not anymore. He was here for her. Draxon watched as Eleanor fought, her movements graceful yet desperate as she held the line. She was not like the others. She did not cower. She did not run. She stood there, defiant to the end, and it stirred something deep within him. He was supposed to be the one to end it, to crush them, to crush her. But for the first time he found himself questioning everything. His mission, his orders, his loyalty to the Empire. The Zoroth had conquered countless worlds, wiped out entire species, but in the end it was always the same. There was no joy in it. There was no meaning. Just the endless cycle of destruction. But this was different. She was different. A single thought pierced his mind, clear and undeniable. What if there was another way? The battle continued to rage, but Draxon's mind was no longer on the fighting. He was focused entirely on Eleanor. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the way her soldiers were beginning to falter. But she refused to yield. She fought as if there were something more at stake than just survival. As if there were something bigger than herself at play. He wanted to understand her. To know what it was that drove her people. But most of all, he wanted to know why, despite everything, he couldn't bring himself to strike her down. As he stood there, watching her fight, the world around him seemed to fall away. The battle, the soldiers, the war, it all faded into the background. All that mattered now was the human woman who had somehow gotten under his skin. And in that moment, Draxon made a choice. Without a word, he stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching against the broken earth. His soldiers noticed the change immediately, but they did not dare to question him. He was walking toward her. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she saw him move. She had been expecting him to order his soldiers to wipe them out, to finish the battle in one decisive strike. But instead, Draxon was walking toward her, alone. The chaos of battle seemed to fade as their gazes met once again. The air between them was charged, thick with unspoken words, with a history neither of them fully understood. What is he doing? Eleanor thought, her grip tightening on her weapon. She had no idea what Draxon wanted, but she knew this was a moment that could change everything. She had no choice but to stand her ground. The sounds of battle echoed around them as Draxon moved forward, his massive frame cutting through the chaos like a living storm. His soldiers, confused by the sudden shift in his behavior, hesitated for a moment. The Zoroth warlord had always been a symbol of ruthless efficiency, his every movement a command in itself. But now, as he advanced towards Captain Eleanor Hayes, his purpose seemed unclear, even to those who had followed him into countless victories. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she watched him approach. Every step he took felt like a challenge to everything she believed about the Zoroth and their cold, imperialistic nature. She had faced many enemies in her life, but none had ever made her question her own resolve like this. She should have been preparing for the worst, should have been expecting him to unleash the full wrath of his army on her people. But instead, there he was, walking towards her as if the battle, the war, had ceased to matter. He stopped mere feet from her, his glowing eyes locking onto hers. The chaos of the battle continued in the background, but in this moment, it felt as if the universe had narrowed to just the two of them. She stood tall, weapon at the ready, but she couldn't help but feel a strange unease creeping into her chest. She had always believed that she could face any challenge, any enemy, and emerge victorious. But this was different. Draxon said nothing at first, his gaze piercing through her, as though searching for something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. It was as if he was struggling to understand what made her and her people so resilient, so defiant, so unwilling to submit. For a long moment neither spoke. The sounds of battle faded into the background, the crackling of plasma fire and the roars of distant explosions no longer in focus. All that mattered was this moment, this brief interlude between two warriors who had been locked in a deadly dance for so long, yet had never truly understood one another. Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she stood firm. "What do you want, Draxon?" she demanded, her voice steady, though her mind raced with questions. Was this a trick? A final play to break her and her soldiers? Draxon's expression was unreadable. "What I want is something I cannot have," he said slowly, his voice low and almost introspective. His words felt heavy, as if he was speaking a truth that had been buried deep inside him for too long. Eleanor's grip tightened on her weapon, but she didn't raise it. She had to understand. Had to know what this meant. "What are you talking about? You have everything. Your army, your power, your conquest, it's all in your grasp. You could end this right now. You could kill us all." The Zoroth warrior's gaze softened ever so slightly, though his posture remained imposing. "No," he murmured, his voice colder now. "That would be easy. Too easy." Eleanor frowned, uncertainty creeping into her. This wasn't the Draxon she had fought for so long. The one who had led his people to war without a second thought. This wasn't the monster she had expected him to be. No, there was something else beneath that armor. A vulnerability, a hesitance that had never been there before. "Then what is it?" she pressed. "Why don't you just finish it? If you've already won, if you're so sure of your superiority, why stand here and talk to me like this?" Draxon's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Eleanor saw something that nearly stopped her heart. A flicker of doubt. Not just about her or her people but about everything. "You don't understand," Draxon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was bred for this, for conquest. For destruction. I've lived my life believing that this was all that mattered. That there was no other purpose to my existence. But then I saw you." He took a step closer, his voice growing stronger. "I saw the way you fight. The way your people fight. And I don't know how to explain it. But I don't want to destroy you, Eleanor Hayes. I don't want to destroy humanity." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and uncertain, as if Draxon himself couldn't quite believe what he was saying. Eleanor blinked, her mind struggling to process the admission. Was he lying? Was this some kind of trick, a last-minute play to weaken her resolve? But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the sincerity there, the confusion, the conflict, the rawness of a creature torn between his nature and something entirely new. Something human. "Why?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with an emotion she hadn't expected. "Why hesitate now? After all the deaths, all the destruction, why care about me? About us?" Draxon's expression darkened, but there was no anger in it. Only the weight of years of unspoken truths. "Because you've shown me something I didn't know existed. Something I thought was beneath me. Hope." Eleanor's breath caught in her chest. Oh, was that what he was trying to say? That in the face of all the destruction, the hopelessness, humanity had found something that even a being like him could not ignore? You've shown me that there's more to life than conquest, Draxon continued, his voice raw. That the fight is not just for survival but for something greater. Something worth protecting. And I can't ignore it. Eleanor's eyes widened as the weight of his words settled in her chest. Hope. The very thing her people had clung to despite every loss, every battle they had fought and lost. The very thing that had driven her and her soldiers to stand firm in the face of overwhelming odds. But she could hardly process it, could hardly comprehend the implications of what Draxon was saying. The warrior who had torn through worlds, who had slaughtered without mercy, was standing before her now, admitting that he had been changed. By her. By the humans. And the truth was undeniable. Draxon's hesitation wasn't just a crack in his resolve, it was a fundamental shift in his perception of the universe. And perhaps, of himself. Eleanor slowly lowered her weapon, her hands trembling as she did so. She didn't know what this meant, didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing for certain. The war was no longer about victory or defeat. It was about something deeper, something far more fragile, and infinitely more powerful. Are you offering us peace? She asked cautiously, almost afraid to hear the answer. Draxon did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood before her, his gaze unwavering. For a long moment, the world seemed to hang suspended in time, as though even the universe itself were waiting for the decision to be made. Finally he spoke, his voice tinged with something she could not place. I'm offering you a choice. A chance. A way out. Whether you choose it, is up to you. Eleanor stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She had expected this to end in fire, in blood, in the death of everything she held dear. But instead Draxon was offering something else. Hope. The very thing that had driven humanity to survive. The question was no longer whether they could win or lose, it was whether they could seize this unexpected opportunity. This fragile thread of peace. And the answer, Eleanor knew, was a choice that would echo through the future of their species. Eleanor stood there, her mind reeling. The battlefield, which had once felt so certain, so clear-cut, was now a blur of confusion. Draxon, the relentless conqueror who had led his forces to ravage humanity, was offering peace. Or, at least, the possibility of it. And yet, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple offer. It was more than that. It was a challenge. One that tested not just the will of her people but her own. She had always known that war was never black and white. But the stakes of this conflict had been clear. Humanity's survival was at risk. Victory meant everything. And yet, now here stood the very warrior who had been the symbol of their destruction, offering them a chance to live. A chance to choose a path that had never seemed possible in the cold calculus of war. She had no idea if Draxon's words were genuine. She had no way of knowing if he was simply playing some long game to soften her resistance, to make humanity lower its guard before striking the final blow. But the truth was, something in her felt different as she looked at him. The raw honesty in his eyes, the palpable conflict, told her that this wasn't just a tactical move. It was something deeper. Something real. What are you asking of us? Eleanor's voice was steady, though a tremor ran through her words. She couldn't help herself. She had led humanity's resistance through so much, fought against so many threats. She had faced horrors and survived. But this was different. Draxon looked down for a moment, his gaze heavy. His dark armor, usually an imposing symbol of power, now seemed almost fragile. As though it were a shell that couldn't contain the storm inside him. I'm asking you to trust me, he said, his voice calm but laced with an emotion that felt almost human. I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that the Zoroth Empire can change. That we can offer you something more than war. Something that will make the destruction we've wrought worth it. Eleanor frowned, her mind working at full speed. Trust. How could she trust the being responsible for so many deaths, so much devastation? Could she truly lay down her weapons, trust him, and believe that peace was possible? We've fought so hard for this, Eleanor said quietly, almost to herself. How can we simply walk away from everything we've sacrificed? From the lives lost? How can I trust that this isn't just a ploy to get us to drop our guard? Draxon's gaze softened, the weight of her words clearly not lost on him. I don't expect you to trust me right away. I don't even know if I fully trust myself. His voice trembled slightly and Eleanor caught the subtle shift. This was a side of him she had never expected. The Zoroth had always been portrayed as ruthless and unfeeling, but here was something else. Something human. I've seen how your people fight. How you cling to hope even in the face of death. And it bothers me, Draxon continued, his voice growing intense. You fight with such strength, such conviction. I've destroyed entire worlds, Captain, and I've never seen anything like this. I don't know what it is, but I don't want to destroy it. I don't want to destroy you. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that there was a way out of this nightmare, a way for humanity to survive without having to sacrifice any more lives. But her mind was still clouded by the years of war, the deaths, the destruction. And yet, as she looked into his eyes, something inside her softened. Maybe it was his honesty. Maybe it was the realization that Draxon wasn't the monster she had believed him to be. Or perhaps it was the possibility of hope itself, something she had almost forgotten in the midst of so many battles. We'll need more than your words, Draxon, Eleanor said slowly. We'll need more than promises. Your people have destroyed so much. How can we trust that this isn't just a trick? Draxon nodded, a deep, almost resigned understanding in his eyes. I know. And I can't undo the past. But I can offer you a future. A future where the Zoroth don't rule over you, but stand alongside you. Where we rebuild instead of tear down. I know it will take time. Will take effort. But it's the only way forward. Eleanor stood silently, the weight of his words settling over her. It was an impossible choice. To accept peace would mean forsaking everything they had fought for, to trust a being who had been their enemy for so long. To reject it would mean more destruction, more death, more war. But it was not just her decision. It was the decision of all humanity. And it wasn't just the future of the humans that hung in the balance. It was the future of the Zoroth as well. Draxon, for all his power, was offering something he had never considered before, the possibility of peace, of change. But could he really change? Could the entire Zoroth Empire truly abandon their centuries-old path of conquest? Eleanor took a deep breath. The silence between them stretched long, but it was not uncomfortable. It felt like a breath before the storm. The last hesitation before everything changed. Let's talk, she said finally, her voice steady. Let's find a way forward. A way for us all. Draxon looked at her, a mixture of relief and uncertainty crossing his features. Are you saying you'll consider it? A truce? Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. I'm saying we'll talk. We'll negotiate. We'll figure out if there's a way to move beyond the war. But this isn't just about you and me, Draxon. It's about all of us. We'll need more than just your word. We'll need a plan. And we'll need proof. Draxon's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a victory yet, not by far. But it was a start. As I said, he replied, his voice low, I can't undo the past. But I can offer you a future. If you'll trust me enough to let me prove it. For the first time, Eleanor believed that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something more. A future that didn't have to be defined by war. A future that didn't have to end in bloodshed. And as the sounds of the battle slowly faded into the background, as the first rays of dawn broke over the war-torn landscape, the possibility of peace began to feel real. The path ahead would be uncertain. The journey would be long. But for the first time in years, the horizon didn't look so bleak. Humanity had survived. And now, with a warrior who had once been their greatest enemy standing beside them, perhaps they could build something new. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.